The United States that you grew up in is currently being destroyed. But what does that mean? When you destroy a nation, of course, you destroy the people within it. And you start with the weakest because they're the easiest to crush. So it's worth hearing their stories just so you know what's happening and what may be coming. We're interested in hearing more today from a man called Jacob Chansley. You may know him as the QAnon shaman. He became pretty famous in the national media right after January 6, 2021. Jacob Chansley's story is pretty simple. He's a veteran, American-born, a patriotic guy who became convinced after the 2020 election that democracy had ended, that the election had been stolen. And so with thousands of other people, he went to Washington to exercise his constitutional rights of protest. And he wound up in the Capitol building. He was unarmed. He didn't threaten anyone. He never showed any sign that he wanted to commit violence, but he was arrested, defamed, and then sent to prison. What's interesting is that it was only about 2 years later that we found out exactly what Jacob Chansley did inside the U.S. Capitol. He was, and the tape shows this unequivocally, led into the Senate chamber by uniformed law enforcement. They showed him how to get in. They opened the door for him, and they ushered him into the room. Now, we don't know the names of those uniformed law enforcement personnel. They have never been tried or convicted of anything. They've never been charged. We don't even know if they've ever been questioned. They got away scot-free. Jacob Chansley's life was destroyed. But again, it was years before we knew that. In the meantime, the national media, acting in concert with the Biden administration, decided to make an example of Jacob Chansley. They denounced him as the QAnon shaman. They screeched about how he was a personal threat to democracy and that anything that happened to him, any punishment that happened to him, was well-deserved. Here's a selection.
In his horned helmet, fur pelts, and face paint, Jacob Chansley became known as the QAnon shaman.
The QAnon shaman.
The QAnon shaman.
The QAnon shaman.
We also probably shouldn't be using the word shaman, given that that is culturally significant for some people. And this was just a rioter in a hat.
The public face of the Capitol riot.
Public face of the insurrection.
The face of the insurrection.
The most prominent symbol of a violent insurrection that attempted to overthrow the United States government.
Chansley stormed the building with his face painted while wearing a fur helmet and horns.
Who stormed the Capitol on January 6th?
Who stormed the Capitol.
Stormed the Capitol on Insurrection Day.
Jacob Chansley is not convicted of a violent crime. And so the judge still believes, however, that the effect of his actions are comparable with a violent act.
Make no mistake, Chansley is a stone cold thug.
What does the DOJ hope to gain by throwing the book so aggressively at Jacob Chansley? 4 years.
Well, in a word, respect.
Compared to many of the defendants in federal court, this is an exceptionally bad dude.
The amazing thing about the whole thing is watching the video, and on the Senate floor, there's a cop who's armed, and a guy bursts in, the QAnon shaman, dressed like a Viking, and he basically talks to him. I'm watching. Shoot him. Yeah. Shoot him. Like, you burst into the United States, if he was dressed like bin Laden, would you have shot him?
Shoot him. That man is called Steve Schmidt. He's a longtime political flack. He spent years being paid to lie for John McCain. He's now being paid by Democratic donors and oligarchs to lie on behalf of the Biden administration in permanent Washington. But that sentiment, the one he just expressed in the tape, is absolutely real. Shoot him. Now, if he'll encourage the murder of Jacob Chansley, why wouldn't he do the same to you? Well, of course, he absolutely would. And it's worth, as you think about that, to consider what Jacob Chansley actually did. He was not committing insurrection. He was not armed. He was in no sense violent. But don't take our word for it. Here's some of the tape. Watch.
Let's go. Let's go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
God bless the men and women in Italy. God bless you guys. We love you. You're on your side.
Come on, let's go. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go.
Thank you, officers. God bless you guys. Thank you for your patience. We really appreciate it.
God bless you guys. Thank you for your patience. We really appreciate it. God bless the men in blue. That's what Jacob Chansley said. And for that, Steve Schmidt, who gets paid by oligarchs to lie, thinks he should be murdered. It's worth, we thought, talking to Jacob Chansley himself, the man at the center of this story, the man whose life has been destroyed by liars like Steve Schmidt. Where is he now? What's he doing? And what does he think of what happened to him? Jacob Chansley joins us now. Jacob Chansley, thanks so much for coming on. So you, I think,
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Of course. You knew, of course, that you were led into the chamber by law enforcement and that you prayed for them once you were inside. What was it like hearing people like Steve Schmidt call for your murder, knowing what you did about what actually happened?
Well, for me, given that I understand now, especially, that January 6th was a deep state setup and a deep state psyop that ensued afterward, I'm not surprised. That's what these people do. The whole media apparatus, what I call the mockingbird media, and the government are in lockstep.
But how frustrating was it? I mean, you may have been in prison when he went on Bill Maher and said that you should be shot to death for being led into the Senate chamber. But how frustrating was it to hear that he and so many other people saying the same thing on behalf of the government when you knew it was all a complete lie?
Well, to be perfectly honest with you, because I understand the depths of government corruption and the mockingbird media's corruption, it was par for the course. And I didn't take it personally because I knew that all they'd done is dehumanize me. But this is what the propaganda in the mockingbird media does, is they dehumanize people, they caricaturize people to fit their narrative. And that's PSYOP 101, Tucker.
Yeah, but these are human beings, and you're an American citizen and a veteran, and you did nothing wrong. So, I mean, you don't sound frustrated by it. Perhaps you've reached a Zen level of acceptance. I don't know. But it's a little shocking, isn't it?
Well, not when you understand what the deep state is and how they operate. So with that said, if you like, I'd like to bolster what it is that I said when I say that the January 6 events was a deep state setup and a deep state psyop by describing what the deep state is in about 2 minutes, if that's okay.
Well, I hope you will.
Okay. So the founding fathers described or characterized tyranny as the consolidation of all three branches of government into a centralized power: executive, legislative, and judicial. Now, when we talk about the deep state, what we're talking about is a tyrannical government. But the deep state is comprised of three aspects. Number one, the first aspect is the circumventing of the checks and balances portions of our three-branch government system. If you corrupt the checks and balances portions, you don't need to corrupt the whole system, just the checks and balances that keep the centralization of power from happening. Right. So this is done through blackmail, bribery, lobbying, etc. Now, the other aspect to the deep state, the second aspect, is the bureaucracy. Now, the bureaucracy is comprised of over 500 federal regulatory agencies that are charged with regulating commerce. Now, these bureaucratic agencies are, in effect, writing law by writing the regulations that tell us what we can buy, what we can sell, what is legal and what is illegal. So that's legislative. They also have their own regulation enforcement agents that enforce their regulations on the American people. So that's executive. And they have their own administrative courts that are outside of the federal court system. So that's judicial. So that's tyranny. And now the third aspect of the deep state is the international corporations and the international banking cartels that have either blackmailed our congressmen or bureaucrats into submission, or they, through bribery and lobbying, they have written the regulations for the bureaucracy to then enforce. So then in this sense, the international corporations and banking cartels are using the government's monopoly on the initiation of force to reinforce their monopolies over our resources, our labor, and our currency. And they are using the government's monopoly on the initiation of force to take our tax dollars, public money, and put it into the private hands of less than 1% of the population. Now, that being said, they use psyops to ensure that we're fighting amongst each other and we don't understand or agree upon how it is that this tyrannical government has taken over the country and is forcing our compliance.
Now, I'm
So,
sorry. I have
with
to
that
say,
said-
I was told you were crazy, and because you wore Viking horns, I thought maybe you were crazy. But I spent my life in Washington, and I don't know what you're going to say next, but what you just said is true. That is absolutely true. That's not crazy. By the way, you described it really well. I've seen it firsthand, and I'm just kind of amazed. I'm not being patronizing. I'm just being sincere. That's not crazy at all, what you just said.
Well, thank you. And no, what's crazy is trusting these bureaucrats and these congressmen, what I call the dinosaurs and the dinosaur circus of DC, trusting them to fix all the problems that they've created over the last several decades. That's crazy. Now, let's talk about January 6th in light of what the deep state is and how it was a deep state setup. So we have Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell stripping Chief Sund of his powers, his emergency powers to put the National Guard there.
That would be the head of the Capitol Police.
Yogananda Pittman. Yes, Chief Sund. You did the interview with him, which was beautiful, by the way, where he basically said that he was stripped of his emergency powers by Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell because they changed the law before January 6th, just so conveniently. And then Yogananda Pittman, according to former Capitol Police Lieutenant Tarek Johnson, she didn't get any of the information that was being given to her from the FBI, the CIA, and the Pentagon to Chief Sund. So here we are. We have the checks and balances portions of our government corrupted, whether that be Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, or Yogananda Pittman, the intelligence officer in the Capitol. So that's the checks and balances, or that's also the bureaucracy. We have CIA, FBI, and the Pentagon not telling Chief Sund what they believed was going to happen on that day. So here it is, the weaponization of information, the non-use of information to ensure that something like January 6th could take place. And we both know there was federal agents in the crowd. We both know Antifa and BLM were instigating the crowd. We both know that Capitol Police were set up. We both know that Nancy Pelosi and Yogananda Pittman sat on their hands while the building was attacked, and Tarek Johnson was trying to evacuate the Senate and the House, and nothing happened. He actually evacuated the Senate because he didn't get the orders because he knew it was the right thing to do. And the whole reason Ashley Babbitt got shot was because Yogananda Pittman refused to acknowledge and evacuate the Senate. Evacuate the House of Representatives like Tarek Johnson evacuated the Senate. And so because there was people in the House of Representatives, the police officer used deadly force against Ashley Babbitt.
Once again, I want to stop you and say I'm looking for the crazy. I'm not hearing it at all. Did you, just to pause, and I don't want to interrupt your narrative for too long, but did you have these views when you showed up to protest the 2020 election on January 6th? I mean, did you understand how the government worked at that point?
Yes, very much so. Look, I wrote a book in 2017 called One Mind at a Time, A Deep State of Illusion by Jacob Angeli. And when I wrote that book, I had an understanding of the entirety of the deep state, how it relates to the education system, how it relates to like propaganda and what Edward Bernays was talking about, the father of propaganda, how it relates to the Mockingbird media and Operation Mockingbird, how it relates to things like secret societies and intelligence agencies and how they're essentially fused, how it relates to people like Jeffrey Epstein and blackmail, how that relates to things like deep underground military bases, the black budget, how that relates to the black market, how that relates to certain research being done in these deep underground military bases, the classifying of technology, and a step further, how it is that relates to things like UFOs, UAPs, and certain things like, for example, interdimensional entities and stuff like that. As a shamanic practitioner, it is actually like my job to kind of know all of that stuff and understand how it all works.
Well, I can just say for myself, I don't understand how it all works, but I know that everything you just mentioned is real. And I don't understand how it fits together, but it's, again, that's the last time I'll say it, but that acknowledging that is real, it's all real, everything you said is real, is not crazy. But back to your experience. So you exit the chamber having, sent God's blessings to all the law enforcement and thanked them for their patience, quote. And then can you just run through for the people who are watching this, like what happened to you next? Like what was the timeline? You left and then what happened?
Well, first of all, let's just say that the reason why I was being escorted around the building was because I volunteered to help the police. I told them there were people in the Senate chamber, and I said, hey, if you guys want, I can help you, like, make sure there's no vandalism, violence, theft, help you clear the chamber. And they're like, yeah, sure, come on, let's go. So that's why we were going from locked door to locked door, was because I volunteered to help them. And then after I exited the building with, the police, I went outside, and shortly thereafter, Donald Trump put out his tweet telling everybody to go home. So that's where that video comes, where I go up to the Capitol doors and I'm telling everybody, stop, stop, stop. Donald Trump said to go home. And I even played Donald Trump's video tweet over my megaphone and told everybody to go home. I went around the side of the building in front of the Capitol and told everybody to go home with my megaphone. So in all honesty, the whole reason why I went to DC was because Washington, D.C. is built on electromagnetic ley lines. These are the lines that go around the planet. They also go all the way down to the core of the earth, and therefore there's portions on the crust where they crisscross one another, and that's where the Washington Monument, the obelisk, the Capitol building, the Lincoln Memorial, the White House, the Supreme Court, all of these buildings are built on these ley lines, like the ancient pyramids and obelisks, temples, and medicine wheels of old. So I understood that this was a sacred space. And if there's going to be 1 million people assembled on the ley lines at this sacred space, that's a lot of energy to be channeled through the grid system. So I believed it was my shamanic duty to go there and ensure that the highest possible frequencies of love and peace and harmony were plugged into the grid. And that was the same reason I went on December 12th in 2020 for the second MAGA Million March. And the media didn't seek to exploit my image then, did they?
So now you're getting into stuff I've never heard of and I can't assess at all, but I think it's interesting. I'm sort of going to Google it after this conversation because I think it's important to be open-minded because clearly we're being lied to. So what's the truth? We should make an effort to find out. But let me just ask you a kind of dumb, straightforward question. One of the reasons it was so easy to call for your murder and to arrest you and send you to prison is because you were dressed in face paint and horns, and so it was kind of obvious that you were a nutcase. I mean, you put your picture on TV. This guy's crazy. He's a threat. That's not the reality that I'm experiencing right now at all, as I've said. But why were you wearing horns and face paint?
Well, I've been dressing that way for over 10 years. I am a spiritual activist more than a political one. And unfortunately, at this point, the evil powers that are all over the world, the powers and principalities, like it talks about in the Bible, they have sought to use the government's monopoly on the initiation of force and the law to push their spiritual, or should I say anti-spiritual agenda. So I've been dressing that way for a long time. I largely take from what is almost like the Hioka shaman tradition, where they shock the cognitive system by addressing in a elaborate fashion. And in doing so, by shocking the cognitive system, they are then able to relay to the people that essentially what they're living in, what they think is reality, is just a cultural paradigm. It's just a social construct. It isn't actually reality. And because their brain has been primed, their mind has been primed by this cognitive shock, they're more likely to absorb the information that the shaman brings to them when the shaman explains to them what objective reality actually is. And we are most certainly living in a social construct and a cultural paradigm that is based on misinformation.
Lies.
Oh, yeah, and I'll tell you right now, Tucker, the regalia, it's not a costume, it is shamanic regalia. It all has symbolism. The coyote tails and the coyote fur in the Dene, or Navajo tradition, the coyote is the trickster or the liar. So I've got the tricksters by the tails. I'm wearing the trickster skin because if the trickster messes with the buffalo, he gets the horns. You see, and all of my tattoos are shamanic tattoos. They are all tribal in nature. They are all very well-earned tattoos. Similar to how military members wear ribbons on their chest, I wear tattoos on my skin to symbolize all of the things that I've accomplished and all of the obstacles and ordeals that I have overcome. So I do practice shamanism. When that woman said that it was culturally inappropriate to call me a shaman. I mean, it's like, well, I actually do practice shamanism, and I guarantee you I could wipe the floor with any of these politicians or any of these woo-woo spiritual gurus anytime, any day of the week.
Amazing. Again, I'm way out of my depth on these questions, but it's the woman on TV who said it was cultural appropriation, couldn't define shamanism at gunpoint, of course. Total moron. But let me ask you, like, when you were arrested and then charged, did you tell anybody, well, wait a second, no, I was led into the chamber by law enforcement. I didn't do anything. I wasn't armed. I don't seek insurrection. I'm totally nonviolent. Did you say that to anybody?
Absolutely. I told the FBI when they arrested me. I told my lawyer. I told the prosecutor, but it didn't fit the narrative. So this is the thing about PSYOPs, okay? And this is why I say that what happened with January 6th was a deep state PSYOP. PSYOPs are about using what's called neuro-linguistic programming. That's the use of words or linguistics to create a pattern in the subconscious portion of people's brains by using trigger words and trigger images, triggering certain like instinctual responses, using words like deadly insurrection, violent insurrection, things like weapons of mass destruction or deadly virus, etc. These things trigger these instinctual responses in the subconscious brain. And because the subconscious brain is most of our neurological activity, if you can hijack the pattern in somebody's subconscious brain, you can hijack their conscious perception of reality. So through neuro-linguistic programming, trigger words being combined with trigger images to create this instinctual response, then you are able to co-opt a person's mind and their perception of reality through this misinformation that's being peddled in the Mockingbird media. Now, the next step is neuro-linguistically programming millions of people, and that is done through the Mockingbird media. It's called critical factor bypass, and that's basically where you saturate all of the media outlets and all of the environment around people with the exact same message, and you repeat it over and over and over and over and over again until that message becomes socially reinforced and everybody believes the lie. Right? Now, the next step after critical factor bypass is mass formation psychosis or mass formation hypnosis, which is where 25 to 30% of the country believe the propaganda they're consuming is real, and they become radicalized based on these instinctual responses and these emotionally triggering images and words. And then they become radicalized and they do the bidding of the government. And if we look at this template for what a PSYOP is, we can see how it relates to things like January 6th, how it relates to things like COVID, how it relates to things like the BLM Antifa riots and the way that they chose to dampen the narrative. And also when it comes to things like weapons of mass destruction, when it comes to anything and everything that is in the government propaganda Mockingbird media apparatus. And January 6th is no exception.
Yeah, and I would say it relates to all kinds of things: immigration, the war in Ukraine, you know, all of this stuff. And again, fact check, true. So do you remember the name of the prosecutor who disregarded the facts and reality and sent you to prison?
Well, it was actually an AUSA. It was an assistant U.S. attorney,
right?
And her name is public record. It's Prosecutor Pascal. Now, the thing is if Christ can forgive the people that were nailing him to the cross, then I can forgive Prosecutor Pascal. I can forgive the United States government for what they did to me. In fact, if I want to live a full and quality life, it would behoove me to forgive them and to let all that go. And anger would cloud my judgment. Rage and outrage and resentment would cloud my judgment. And I wouldn't be able to relay this information as much or as easily as I am now if I had resentment and anger and, resentment holding me back.
So even when you see the tape of Steve Schmidt calling for your killing, you have forgiven?
Yeah, absolutely. The guy is believing lies. He's trusting proven liars, and he's become a puppet for the propaganda apparatus. I mean, to a certain extent, I feel sorry for him. It must be really dumb. It must be really hard to be that dumb.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a happy life, and he's obviously not a happy person. But you seem to be. How long did you spend in prison, all in?
27 months total behind bars, 10 and a half of which was in solitary confinement. And then I spent like 2 months in either house arrest or on in a halfway house. So a total of 29 months in federal custody.
Did anyone in authority reach out to try and help you?
Well, I know that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar went to try to see me at the Alexandria Detention Center, and they were told to go around the back and wait, and they waited there for like 3 hours, only to basically be ghosted. I mean, aside from yourself talking about what happened, which God bless you, thank you for that.
Of course.
No, nobody really reached out. And what's really crazy, I mean, I got lots of letters, and that really kept me going, and lots of prayers. But as far as like, I think that what you did as far as airing that footage actually was vital. So much so because I was told that prior to you airing that footage, questioning the propaganda and the narrative that was out there about January 6th was very taboo. But once the poster boy was shown to be not what the media said they were because of what you did, that opened the door to question the narrative. It fractured the narrative. And now we're at a place where anyone and everyone can say, no, I don't believe the government's lies. I mean, we've been lied to routinely for decades by every authority figure we can imagine. College professors, our teachers, politicians, CEOs, government officials, the Mockingbird media. We've been lied to routinely for decades, so it's no wonder everybody's so confused and doesn't know what to believe.
Where does it go from here, do you think?
Well, it's important to understand that the war that we are fighting is a war for our minds and our hearts, okay? So there's something called full spectrum dominance. It's a military term, and it basically means control over every aspect of everybody's life. And it starts with, number one, the control of people's minds through propaganda, psyops, and psychological warfare. And once you've taken control of people's minds and the paradigm that they live in, then you gain control over the land, the seas, the air and the airspace, subterranean, deep underground military bases, extraterrestrial, space and satellites, chemical and biological agents and weapons, technology, cell phone towers, satellites, TV, radio, etc., computers, and then also things like our currency, things like our food supply, things like our water supply, etc. This is full spectrum dominance. Now, less than 1% of the population is running the deep state through the international corporations, the international banking cartel. They are moving our public tax dollars into their private hands through things like subsidies, things like government contracts, things like bank bailouts, etc. And what they're basically doing is they're creating a more intense and consolidated full spectrum dominant system. So this is part of the reason why they went after Trump supporters with January 6th and Trump, because it is the Trump supporters that are the most against the New World Order, one world government, this globalist attempt to take over the world, right? And essentially create a full spectrum dominant system all over the planet for generations to come. And I don't think that Trump just doing what it is that he has been doing as far as campaigning and what he's been saying on the campaign trail is the only reason why they don't want him on the ballot. I mean, if you think about it, the only people that believe, more people on the Democrat side and in Democrat positions of power believe Trump is going to win, because that's why they're going after him, trying to throw him in jail. That's why they're trying to, get him off the ballot, because they know he's going to win. But what are they really afraid of? Well, if you look into the patents that Donald Trump declassified in 2020, 3 patents that Donald Trump declassified, they were filed by a man named Salvador Pius. These 3 patents have the ability to just make this full spectrum dominant system completely obsolete. Number 1 is a 0-point energy engine. That means we're extracting energy from like the vacuum or the 0 point of space and time, which is filled with energy. It's an infinite clean energy supply. Number 2, a room temperature superconductor that allows a 0-point energy engine to function without overheating. And number 3, it's called a TR-3B. That's a triangular shaped craft that uses what's called inertia propulsion or anti-gravity to not just fly through the air, but also to go underwater to the bottom of the ocean or go into outer space. So this actually threatens the full spectrum dominant system of the deep state. And I think, imagine what Trump is going to do when he gets back in office. He released these patents in 2020, and even he's not really talking about it, but I guarantee you they're real. You can look them up. I can send you the links to the patents on Google.
I got to say, I've had very few conversations where the spread between public perception and even my perception and the reality was wider than in this one. I mean, I can't assess anything that you just said. I've never heard of any of it before. Obviously my fault, but I think it's legitimately interesting, and so are you. And I appreciate your taking all this time to talk to us, and I hope a lot of people see this and follow up. And just final question. If people want to know more, maybe some people still think you're crazy, and that's up to them, of course. But for people who want to hear more about what you think, where do they find it?
You can go to my website, ForbiddenTruthAcademy.com. That's Forbidden Truth, TRUTH, Academy.com. And on ForbiddenTruthAcademy.com, we have all sorts of free courses. We have free podcasts, free interviews, literally dozens of hours of free content. If you like what you've heard here, you can really dive deep through all of that content. We also have some pretty awesome merchandise. We have my book for sale as well, One Mind at a Time, A Deep State of Illusion. You can get on my website as well. And if people want to book me for another interview or something, my email is on my website. And they can also follow me on X or Twitter at America Shaman. That's America Shaman, at America Shaman on Twitter or X.
Jake Chansley, thank you so much for spending all this time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's my honor, my pleasure. God bless you, Tucker.
God bless. Free speech is bigger than any one person or any one organization. Societies are defined by what they will not permit. What we're watching is the total inversion of virtue.